Hey everybody, welcome back to my channel. Today we're going to be going over the kind of modeling process that I took for these grapes. So what I wanted to do was show everybody the process that I went through to model these, as well as some of the techniques that I used, because it's a little bit different than what you would traditionally think that it would be. Okay, so starting off, one of the things that I really did here to just kind of focus on like making this as efficient as possible was I used sweep curves. If you haven't used sweep mesh curves before, they are incredibly helpful, especially when you're trying to create like multi-tapered curves. So like this allowed me to taper it using a graph throughout the entire process that I didn't have to go back and manually model. And I did this a couple of times. Part of this was used to sort of create the different nodes that each branch kind of had. So if you've ever looked at grapes, you'll notice that the way that they grow is kind of very node-based. So there's one main branch, and then there's little nodes that breach off of that branch. And then each one of those little nodes almost has like a little bump or a connection point. This was something that I was trying to model here. The other thing I was trying to do was to show the kind of roughness of the attachment point to the actual grape. I didn't want to go too crazy with this because the reality is it's such a minute, small detail that you wouldn't really see it, but I did want to have some sort of depth there that would then be kind of accentuated by a height map later on. So this is just kind of breaking down that front node that actually connects to the grape and giving it some shape and some character in order to just not have like a flat cylinder going into the grape. One of the big focuses here was to ensure that I was making each grape branch differently. I did not want to have the same branch all over the place. I wanted to make sure I had enough organic variation to show that this, could like possibly be a real image. That was kind of the goal with this whole project, was to create something that somebody would look at and be like, oh, hey, cool, that's a picture of grapes, and not realize that it was a 3D render. So one of the main things that I did was to make sure that there was as much variation as possible. And you can see here I'm adding more nodes, and I'm just kind of changing the way the branch connects. I did get a little lazier kind of later on in the project with the little node connection points on the branches, but they are there on the base branches that I used in order to just kind of showcase that, because that's really all you were going to see. You weren't going to see much of the main attachment to the main branch. The concept here was to just make as many sort of template branches as I could. That way I could work off of them and then use them for whatever I needed to. So if I needed to add a new node, if I wanted to add a small node to a branch, or if I needed to kind of offshoot one branch to another branch, whatever I had to do, I could do, because I had a great variety of different pieces to work with. Okay, so this is the point in the video where I interrupt for a few minutes just to tell you guys it takes a lot of effort and a lot of work to get these videos to you on YouTube for free. One of the things that I have always tried to do is make sure that I'm never paywalling my content behind anything that I consider unnecessary. And so one of the ways that you can support that and you can continue helping me make sure I can do that is by joining me as a member on YouTube or joining my Patreon, both of which you get member exclusive videos, which will be starting this week, as well as on Patreon you get free model download. You can get the entire grape scene on my Patreon as long as you join one of my subscription tiers, even the lowest tier. All tiers get the free models. But these are just two ways that you can help support the channel and what I do here, and help me continue growing my content so I don't have to necessarily lock everything behind a bunch of paid courses, because that's the last thing that I want to do. And if you can't do that, obviously I understand, but if you can take a moment to like the video, leave a comment, share, do any of those three things, they really do help grow this channel. Again, my goal is to always create as much of a free to learn environment as possible, but I do also have to make sure I do make this at least somewhat worth the amount of time that I have to spend on this. So if you can join one of those things, you obviously get your name at the end of the credits like everyone who supports me does on either Twitch, YouTube, or Patreon, as well as you get access to a bunch of cool exclusive stuff. So thanks, let's go ahead and get back into the video. And so after all was said and done, I started looking at what else I might need, and then I started adding branches. So I picked my main one, I scaled it up, and then I started looking into adding it to the main branch. So one of the big things I did here was I made sure each branch was the same as the main branch when it came to the faces on the outside. So every face around the outside there were 8 of them on both the main branch and the small branch. This is because it makes it easier to kind of divide and cut the branch and then just re-add the other ones to it. It's just a tactic that I use when I'm trying to do things like pipes or anything that has to be interconnected in some sort of weird network. I will keep the amount of faces as low as possible, so adding them in and smoothing them isn't that difficult. So here's where I started to add the first grape, and then this is where I decided to start adding variation. If you ever look at grapes, there is variation. That's one of the things that I see with a lot of like CG grapes, is that there's never any variation. So grapes have all sorts of different shapes and sizes and kind of like damage to them. So if you ever pick up a bundle of grapes, you'll see some like barrel shaped ones, you'll see some dented ones and some wrinkly ones. And this was something I really wanted to, as much as I could in the model without making it too high detailed, I wanted to recreate. So I've got some little round ones, I've got some barrel shaped ones, I've got some like deformed sort of like oblong ones. Later on in this process, I actually added an elongated grape because I was looking at an actual grape stem that we had, and I was seeing these elongated grapes on it. So I was really trying to make sure that I had as much variety in this project as possible, because that is kind of what sells the realism when it comes to the model itself, is that there is differentiation in there. There's a bunch of variety that doesn't make you look at it and go, these are all the same. Like, this is just the same object repeated over and over again. This was another thing that I started to do. I didn't necessarily carry this through the model entirely, but I wanted to have little branches that were broken off already. If you ever buy one from the store, you know that they're always kind of just torn apart and there's like chunks missing. And one of the things that usually gets left behind is like the base of the stem. So I wanted to make sure that the base of the stem was there on a couple different branches. I don't think, if I remember correctly, I don't think I added too many of them. But I know they're there because I wanted to make sure that I, again, was focusing on making this as realistic looking as possible. Even though the objects are very simple and in turn don't look very real, the texturing and the rendering after adding all the subsurface scattering was going to help sell this further than it actually was as just a model. One of the big things that I found super difficult with this one is the concept of density. So grape branches themselves are actually very dense. Like, grapes are pretty large and dense little objects on these little bundles. And so throughout my initial build, I was having a lot of open air spaces that I wanted to fill, but I didn't necessarily want to just make big grapes to fill those. So I had to kind of scale back some of this stuff, and some of my branches just ended up being too long. So I had to go back and just kind of adjust them and pull them in and make them a little bit more realistic looking, because most of the nodes that branch off that actually hold a grape don't actually get that big. So that was one of the things that I kind of discovered a little bit later in this process that was kind of an annoyance, but it was just something I had to fix. Then once I had kind of my first like big branch built out, I actually took that branch and duplicated it down. This was the only instance where I actually mirrored something because I wanted to just start getting the shape ready. I wanted to make sure I had the grapes kind of curving underneath. This is where I started to actually kind of form the silhouette of the grapes and figure out like, what does this bunch look like? And so I was working off of a reference image that I just found off of Google and trying to match the shape as best as possible. This is also where I started to kind of increase the size of the grapes to help fill in that density issue a little bit. And then we just kind of continue working on throughout this entire process on adding new branches and kind of adding just different sort of shapes to this, because the thing that we're trying to do is not repeat shapes, because grapes themselves don't really repeat in shape. This was also something I decided to do. I decided to finish the front of the grapes before I finished the entire body of the grapes. The reason being is that I wanted to have an endpoint that was visible to me. I wanted to be able to see like, okay, so this eventually has to taper to this point. This was something that became really, really helpful, not only for the scale of the branches, but it helped me kind of take everything and just start kind of building that conical shape that most grapes grow in. Now, one of the things that I kind of noticed near the end of this project, which was kind of an unfortunate thing, but it kind of is what it is that gravity-wise, the grapes didn't make a ton of sense. They were just kind of sitting there. And if it was something I really cared about going back and changing, I totally could. It would have been a lot of reworking of the model and likely reworking of the textures and the UVs, and it just wasn't something I was really necessarily looking at, wanting to do. I wanted to do this as a render study and just leave it at that. I didn't want this to be some like incredible piece of art that was, going to get me millions of views, because that just wasn't the goal. But the idea here was to showcase as much variety as possible and make them feel as real as possible. And I think I achieved that with what I was kind of building out. Even though gravity-wise the bunch didn't really make sense, there's a lot to be kind of had here when it came to modeling this and setting this up, because most of the time when you think about stuff like this would be something that you'd probably handle procedurally. I do think this is an awesome exercise for somebody if they want to learn things like subsurface scattering as well as like minorly complex organic modeling because of the branches and everything. One of the things that was really difficult was as this thing got more dense, grapes and branches started to collide. And so finding a good balance of density without having everything going through each other was also very difficult, because the last thing I wanted to do was have a bunch of what we would call like video game grapes, which is just going to be like a mass that looks like grapes. I wanted to make sure you could see the individuality in each one of the little pieces of fruit. You can see throughout the whole process too, I started building and developing more stem variants because I wanted to make sure that I was being as different as possible with each one of these branches. I didn't want any one branch to be necessarily super visibly the same. Some of them ended up being that way, but you really can't tell in the final render, and that was the goal. I wanted to make sure that, like, even though this thing was made up of a bunch of different branches that were all kind of spawned from the same branch, I wanted to make sure that as an individual final model, it didn't really look that way. And when I get to this stage, this is where I started to kind of find the areas where I'm like, okay, I can fill this in with a little bit, and then I had to adjust and figure out like where stuff was sitting. Again, still working with these very simplified objects so I don't have to really deal with a lot of complexity, because the reality here is, like, if you're trying to do a model that is this dense, that has this much geometry and like this much sort of like stuff going on, you don't want to add complexity. So you don't want to have these hyper high poly branches. Because the reality is we're going to handle most of that in texturing anyway. It's not going to really matter. This is one of those projects where I knew I wanted to get kind of close to it, but I knew I didn't need to get that close to it. So the reality is I won't be doing any renders of like the base of the grape connecting to the vine, because there's no detail there. I didn't build that detail in. That's something that, sure, I could have if I wanted to, but that wasn't the goal here. So the real focus on this was just making sure it looked as realistic as possible, and I could zoom it if I really wanted to, which it ended up being actually a really neat kind of object to zoom into because of the way the texturing ended up working out. But you can see that there is a lot of simplicity to this. There wasn't really a lot of complexity to this, and I didn't want this to be a dense, complex model that took me days to model. This took me maybe a couple of hours, and there really wasn't a lot of time spent on the model. So this is kind of a lesson to those people who try to like overcomplicate things. Like, don't think about it so heavily. Like, sometimes simple is best, and there's nothing wrong with that. It does not have to be, you don't have to see all of the individual cells connecting the branches together. Like, you can do a basic model and then texture it out and call it good. You're probably never going to go that hyper close to this unless that's your goal. I don't know what the final count on this entire model was for like the individualized branches. I'll probably have that on my ArtStation, but I did create quite a few different variations of branches just to make sure that, again, like, I wasn't repeating shapes, because that's one of the main things that just kills a CG image, is that if you reuse shapes, because our eyes pick up on that immediately. We see that and we're like, this isn't real. That is one of the biggest things I was trying to avoid. I wasn't really actually at the beginning of this project shooting for like hyper realism. It just kind of happened, which I'm super happy about. I was more focused on learning like subsurface scattering and kind of how to work with it a little bit more, because as a hard surface modeler, I don't really work with it much. I don't use it all that much, and it's something that I find really cool, and it's something that I wanted to really play with and learn. So this was kind of the purpose for this project. This is where it kind of gets more into the figuring out the shape of this, and you can see how I'm like, well, you know, that branch was way too long. It didn't have another node coming off of it. So in turn, I wanted to add a new node and just kind of flesh that out a little bit, because we don't want any really long shapes. I didn't want anything that was going to take your eye off of like the main focus, which was the grapes. I didn't want you to look at this and say, yeah, you know, he's got some really long branches in there that don't make it really any sense. And I think that concept got sold pretty well. This is also where I start to taper the model in a little bit. This is where at the end of the branch, you know, you start to get less large, dense branches. You start to get these little small offshoots. And so this is where the grapes are kind of forming their little cone shape, and that's where they're kind of ending off. I think the most difficult part about this entire thing was just figuring out how to fill the open areas without making it feel like it was just over, like, crowded. And sometimes it's really easy to get carried away and add a bunch of shapes and just not worry about having them connecting to everything. But the reality is like I was really trying to focus here to make sure that everything actually like lived somewhere. And I also wanted to have some of those little like baby grapes that you get that grow off the side of the vine that don't necessarily get their own branch, because that's something that happens a lot, and it's one of the details that I think gets missed a lot. And so you can see it in the final render that there's a couple little baby grapes hidden throughout the branch, just to kind of add a little bit of variety, a little bit of texture to the model itself, because this is the first step. This is where we're developing what our model's texture is going to be before we ever even start putting like paint to the model. It's really where we just establish like this is what the texture of it looks like this is how the model flows. And so this is a really important stage, and it's not something that you should skip, even on a simple project like a bunch of grapes. And eventually at the end of this model, it gets subdivided and then exported for UVing on another application, and then we move into the texturing, and that'll be the next video in this little mini series that we're doing here. And that's it for this video, everybody. Thank you so much for watching and hanging out. Again, I appreciate you for being here and engaging with my content and joining the community. And if you want to take that a step further and join one of my membership tiers or my Patreon like some of these people, you can go ahead and click the link in my bio or click that membership button and join on the YouTube channel to help support what I do here and keep what I do free. But again, thank you so much for watching. I appreciate it as always, and I will see you all in the next video.